friends, and welcome back to another video. As it is the middle of the year, I have a video that I've been wanting to do, and that is I basically want to run through all of the books that I've read so far this year. I'm actually keeping track of my books on GoodReads this year. It's something I always intend to do but never actually do. So normally where I try and aim for about 50 books, and I don't always kind of hit that each year, but that's kind of like my vague goal every year. But when I set up my GoodReads and kind of started, inputting all the books I'd read so far this year a couple of months ago, I realized I was well beyond that already. And I do think that's partly because I'm making an effort, but also partly because I'm reading manga now. And manga is a wonderful, valid form of reading, just that the volumes are a lot quicker to get through, so my number is higher. I've got my list, so let's go through and talk about the 63 books I've read so far this year. So the first book I read was Gilgamesh Retold by Jenny Lewis. Basically, this is like a retelling of the Gilgamesh tale, so instead of just a translation, it's a retelling. And it says here that Jenny Lewis relocates Gilgamesh to its earlier original roots in Sumerian society where men and women were more equal. Now, I actually was kind of struggling to read at this time, but I needed to get it done because it was part of the Blossom Book Club. So I ended up listening to it on audiobook and reading it because I had the book as well. So I was kind of doing both at once because I was struggling to concentrate. As I don't really feel like a strong poetry reader, that was quite nice having someone read it to me while I could also see the format in the book. And I gave this 3 stars. I think I did enjoy the poetry of it. I enjoyed the structure of it and the flow. I thought it was beautiful. But as far as the story of Gilgamesh, I did not like it anywhere near as much as I liked the one that I read by Stephen Mitchell a couple of years ago. And I know both of those retellings or translations, whatever you want to call them, have different purposes, have different intentions, but just from an enjoyment standpoint, I much preferred the storytelling in Stephen Mitchell's version. I also liked the characters, even if I could see they're very flawed. I liked the characters in his version. I didn't like any of the characters in Jenny Lewis's version. Next, I read 13 Months of Sunrise by Rania Mamoun and translated by Elizabeth Jaquette. I just found this on my Kindle when I was kind of scrolling through the Kindle store. This was a collection of short stories, and it took me quite a while to get through because I just didn't sink into any of the stories. I didn't really enjoy this book, which made me quite sad. I only gave it 2 stars in the end. I can't even really remember I think I did finish it, but I didn't enjoy it. I do remember kind of almost liking some of it, but just, I don't know, maybe it was the translation that was just not as successful. Sometimes that happens, but just for me, I found it hard to emotionally engage in these stories. And I just remember not loving it. Then, because my reading wasn't going so well, I decided to jump right in to manga, and I did a whole vlog on me trying to get into manga, and that was a really, really fun video to film. It was a great week of reading for me. I read so much in that week. So I'll tell you about some of the series that I read. I won't tell you about each individual volume, but I have read Full Metal Alchemist 1 to 9, I think it was, and I have bought the rest to continue reading. I haven't gotten around to them yet, but I was really enjoying Full Metal Alchemist. It is so fun. I was not expecting to like it as much as I did. I thought it was going to feel younger and more boyish. I don't know. It's just sort of the image I had in my head. And it does, I suppose it is younger targeted. It feels youthful. It's so fun and full of life. There's a lot of humor, and just the affection and tenderness in the relationship between the 2 brothers, I adore. I really like their dynamic and their backstory and these 2 young underdogs trying to take on the world. I don't know, it's just really fun. So I think I've given the volumes that I've read either 4 or 5 stars so far. Then Goodnight Pun Pun. I started out loving this series. I think I've read 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. The first volume I adored. I was like, holy shit, this is it. This is where manga's at. Loved it. It was dark, but it also had this kind of really uncomfortable sense of humor. At least that came through for me. I don't know, maybe I was reading into it something that wasn't there, but I thought it was quite funny in a really dark sort of way. But as the volumes have progressed, I've liked it less and less each volume. I'm still interested in the story of Pun Pun. I want to see what happens to him. I think it's probably going to be quite a bad ending judging from the sense and the feeling I'm getting from Inio Asano. I don't know, I'm just not enjoying it as much anymore, so I've kind of stopped reading it. I will finish it at some point. I just kind of have to like work myself up to each new volume. So I gave the very first volume 5 stars, but they've all kind of started to drop off since then. Then I read Orange, which is a hugely popular series and it's quite short as far as like manga series go. I read the first omnibus, which is the first 3 volumes in that vlog, and I adored it. It's quite an emotional story about a group of friends in high school who get letters, our main character, she gets a letter from herself in the future informing her that one of her best friends is going to die soon. And this letter kind of walks her through things that her future self wants her to do in order to save him. So I loved the first volume. I thought it was beautiful. The second volume I liked less, and I sort of had that inkling that dealing with topics of mental health and stuff, I was concerned about how it was going to wind up, and I still love it for the emotional impact, but I don't know, for me it didn't feel satisfying. I know a lot of people would disagree with that. For a lot of people this is their favourite manga ever. For me it did not feel satisfying, and I'm not sure that I love the ending. What I will say for it though is I think it taught me a lot about the potential of shoujo manga, that is manga that's kind of targeted towards teen girls. A lot of the shoujo manga I'd been exposed to before was very much just like high school romance, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't do as much for me, I guess. Whereas this still had the high school romance and the high school angst stuff going on, but it had such a compelling and interesting narrative behind it to kind of like give it more weight. So it definitely gave me more of an appreciation for what shoujo manga could be. And then I read a couple of like just first volumes that I didn't really like of a various series that I haven't continued with. One was I Hear the Sunspot, another was Kimine Todoke, and Bakuman. I didn't really like them. The first 2, there's nothing wrong with them, I just wasn't particularly excited about them. Bakuman was just sexist and I wasn't interested in continuing with that. I've also read the first volume of Astra Lost in Space. I really liked that. That was just so fun and I will continue with that. I'm not as like compelled to like get to the end of that, if that makes sense. Like for me that was just a good time. So I want to finish off some of the other series that I have that I'm kind of midway through before I pick up the rest of that series. Skullface Bookseller Honda-san, I've read 1 to 3. I think number 4 is to be released later this year. I really love it. The first volume I think certainly is the strongest of the series so far, but it's just really fun, and as a bookseller I relate to a lot of it. I did also read a few of Inio Asano's other works during that manga vlog. One was Downfall. That was kind of, I think, semi-autobiographical, and Inio Asano's hard. The other ones I read was Girl on a Shore. Both were beautiful. The artwork is incredible and so expressive, and Inio Asano definitely kind of caters to an older audience, but they're dark. There's no getting around that. They're really dark. They deal with some pretty intense stuff like sexual assault. Like it's pretty intense. And sometimes I'm not always sure, especially like in Downfall, given that it's semi-autobiographical, I wasn't sure how to feel about it basically. I wasn't sure if this stuff was done in a self-aware sort of way or if it's messed up basically. So I'm still not sure how to feel about Inio Asano. His are some of the works that I've enjoyed the most in terms of just like the emotional payoff and how compelling and invested I've become in those while I'm reading them. They've also been the most challenging for me on like an emotional level, but also just on like a moral one. I've also read a couple of volumes of Waiting for Spring just on my Kindle. These are just like a cute little high school shoujo. They're quite sweet. They're fun. They're fun. They're nothing crazy amazing, but they're fun. Then I read Pink by Kyoko Okazaki. This was like a older female targeted demographic. Manga's kind of organized not so much by genre but by the intended demographic. This one I was expecting to like a lot more than I did. It was fine. I gave it 3 stars, but it was nothing, I don't know. I wasn't that invested in the story or the characters that there was much emotional payoff for me by the end of the story. Children of the Whales. Children of the Whales. This has probably been the most surprising of the manga series for me. I almost didn't pick this one up, but then kind of went back and did pick up the first volume and was blown away. utterly blown away. 5 stars without a doubt. Probably the best or one of the best mangas that I've read. The artwork in this is just insanely beautiful. Nothing else I've read rivals it. It's so delicate and so detailed, and the world building in this is just absolutely second to none. This story is just not at all what I was expecting. It's just so much more interesting, so much bigger than I thought it was going to be. So after enjoying the first one so much, and then number 2 and number 3, I've ordered, I think, all of the ones that are available, and I've now read up to number 9 or 10. I will say, and I've said this before, that the weakness in this story is without a doubt the character development. I barely remember the names of most of the characters, let alone like have any emotional attachment to them at all. Having said all that, this is probably still, this and Full Metal Alchemist will probably be the manga series that I've enjoyed the most. Now back to some books. I read The Far Away Nearby by Rebecca Solnit with my book club. This is the second Rebecca Solnit book I've read. The first one was A Field Guide to Getting Lost I read last year, and I adored that. This one I liked less, but I still really enjoyed it. It was very Rebecca Solnit in the fact that it's kind of like a collection of essays that are somewhat themed, like they do go together. I remember this one talking a lot about Frankenstein and ice and the Arctic and her sick mother. I think she had dementia or something. It's been a little while since I read it. I did really like it. I gave this one 4 stars. I don't think it was as good for me as A Field Guide to Getting Lost was though. But I still just really enjoy her writing and the kind of journey she takes us on throughout the book. So Rebecca Solnit is an author I do want to return to. Then I read Delta of Venus by Anais Nin. This is something that I just came across on my Kindle. I know it's kind of really super famous. I'd never heard of it before. And this is basically erotica. I think from memory, was it written for like some rich man or something? It's been a while. And this was a book that I felt so emotionally conflicted about. Some of it was incredibly beautifully written. Some of it was so evocative and just like the senses and these characters kind of really jumped off the page. It was incredible reading this. But then quite a lot of it was really messed up. I don't know how else to say it. There was like rape, pedophilia, like necrophilia, like... And I get that erotica can allow us to explore some really, dark parts of the human psyche, I guess. And I think that's really reflected in the reviews on GoodReads. Some people are just like utterly appalled that this is considered a classic or anything even close to it. And other people were just like reveling in the language and, all of it. So I was kind of somewhere in between. Some of it I loved, some of it I just really wish I hadn't read. Another manga I read was Made in Railways by Asumiku Nakamura. This was a collection of short stories in manga form. And they all had like a running theme of being connected to trains, whether that was the story took place on a train station or whatever. Like they were all something to do with trains. And the art in this was beautiful. I loved especially like the watercolor pages. The stories were really quite sweet. I loved that it had that theme of railways and trains. But for me, they were really quite short. And so a lot of them just didn't feel very substantial. But for the most part, this was just like a fun, easy blow through sort of read that didn't, I don't know. I think, what did I give it? 3 stars? Oh, I only gave it 2. Apparently I feel more generous about it now in hindsight. Oh, the next one was a book I read during the stay-at-home reading rush, which was Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. And Tanya is a throat singer, I think, from memory. I know that the people I work with, some of them like love her music. And we got this book in, it's fiction, but it's also kind of partly memoir, but it's mixed in with this kind of really intense earth-based spirituality, mythology, folklore stuff. This is a book I remember saying I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't even know how I felt about it. Part of me thought it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. And the other part of me was like, what did I read? I gave it 3 stars, and I think that was just because I was quite confused. I wasn't really sure how to feel about it. But now that I've gotten a bit of space, I think I read this back early April, I'm sort of wanting to read it again. I'm wondering if revisiting it, maybe it was just like the shock of not knowing what I was getting into. I thought it was more memoir with a bit of fiction. It was the other way around. It was definitely much like grander, more magical, much more like fantastical. much more spiritual than I was expecting. Then I read All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This was the first book in the Murderbot Diaries. This was a book that I got in the Life's Library a few months ago. Hank Green picked it out for us to read and I just hadn't gotten around to it. It's just a short book. I think it's about 150 pages. But oh my god, did I love this book. This is like a space sci-fi novella where our protagonist is a android. It calls itself Murderbot, but basically it's hacked its own governor module, so it is, for all intents and purposes, sentient. And we're basically on this planet where this Murderbot has been kind of assigned as a security unit to some explorers. But like stuff goes wrong and like a conspiracy emerges and Murderbot has to protect these people against a lot more than they signed up for basically. And it's just very fast paced, it's very action packed. Murderbot is just a wonderful narrator because it's human enough that we can identify with a lot of it, but it's also really quite not human, so that it's removed in a lot of ways from our, you know, ridiculous human illogical thinking, but it's also quite humorous with our Murderbot having its own anxieties and its own kind of like questioning itself and what is right and what is not. It's just brilliantly done, and I think it's like quite deceptively simple. And I was just so chuffed after I read that. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. And Laura, my friend Laura from Aquamarine 18 informed me that this was not just a standalone book. It was a series. I was so chuffed. I was so excited. So thanks to Laura, I've now read 3 of the Murderbot Diaries. I think there's 2 more. And I fall more and more in love with this series with every page. I think it would probably be one of my favorite things that I've discovered all year. Then I read Witch Body by Sabrina Scott. This is a graphic novel. I didn't love this. I don't really know what to say about it. It's beautiful. The art's incredible. And there were bits of it that I thought were really insightful and inspiring. But for me, it just didn't feel cohesive, and the art never really felt like it matched or added to what words were on the page. I don't know. I'm glad I read it because I've been meaning to read it for a while, but for me, it didn't meet my expectations. Then also during that stay-at-home reading rush, I read The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. This is one of my best friends. It's one of her favorite books, and she's been trying to get me to read it for, I don't know, probably like 2 or 3 years. And I was always quite intimidated actually by the size. It's about 500 pages and I get nervous by anything that's over 400. So the fact that I decided to read this in the middle of a reading rush, I don't know. I'm pretty proud of myself for that. And I flew through this because the first half, even, 3/4 of this book are so ridiculously fun. It's just one of those like silly adventure stories where like one thing after the other goes wrong and then like people get caught up in this silly over the top ridiculous story, but it's all just a really fun good time with a lot of humor mixed through it. I will say I started to get a bit bored by like the last 100 pages or so. For me it just kind of felt like it was trying to wrap up and neatly tie up every loose end, and it just felt like it was over explaining the ending in a way, I guess, and I just grew tired of it. I don't know, like it didn't have the same charm as the first half or 3/4 had. So I think in the end, even though like the first half was almost 4 pushing 4.5 stars for me, by the end of it I felt less generous towards it, I guess. So I think I ended up giving it a 3.5. Then I listened to an audiobook that I forgot to include in one of my favorites videos because I loved it. It was Come, a Memoir by Rita Therese. This is a memoir from a Melbourne or Australian, I think she's from Melbourne, sex worker. And it was just, it was intense. This was an emotional roller coaster. Rita basically talks us through, I don't know, it's like a memoir. So it's a story of her life and her experience as a sex worker and in various different forms and fields. And also just her struggles with mental illness and the losses she's experienced and the difficulties that her family has been through with mental illness. And it was just, I listened to this while playing Animal Crossing. And I was sobbing like a baby. This was an intense ride. It was incredible. It was just really raw. I don't know how else to put it. It was raw. Next was Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. This was quite a short book that I've been meaning to read for a little while. It was kind of a generational story about race and class. and it was really beautifully done, and especially the audiobook. I'm really glad I listened to it on audiobook. I'm sure the book was, you know, successful as well, but the audiobook, all of the different characters, because it was narrated, each chapter was narrated by a few different characters. They were performed. They had different people performing those chapters. So I really, really got a sense of all of these different characters and their relationship with each other. And it just felt so alive to me. It was beautiful. Then I read a couple of Tove Jansson books. I read last year the Summer book, which I really loved. So I tried to read a couple of her other books because of that. I have not had as much success with her other work. I read the first book of The Moomins and the Great Flood. I don't know, for me that was kind of cute, but it didn't have the charm for me that a lot of people talk about. And like, I love a good children's story that like has a lot of like magical, whimsical charm. This didn't do a lot for me, to be perfectly honest. And then I also read Art in Nature, which from memory was a collection of short stories. There were elements of this book that I liked, but overall it wasn't a love for me like the Summer book was. So I don't know. I'm feeling less inclined to continue like reading more of Tove Jansson's back catalogue. The Summer book was beautiful, but I haven't enjoyed the rest of her work as much as I thought I was going to. Then I read How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell, which was another Blossom Book Club book. And I really, really liked this book. I think this was a solid 4.5 stars for me. Although the book definitely does deal with the concept of how to do nothing, but more from the lens of what we are taught is a valuable use of our time, and how we should be spending our time. It very much feels like a cultural critique as opposed to like a self-help book of literally how to do nothing. And in fact, Jenny Odell is quite critical of, you know, those ideas of just go back to nature or just check out or just meditate for an hour. Instead, this book I think is more trying to get to the bottom of how we can exist in our everyday world in a way that is healthy for us and that challenges some of the systems that demand so much of our attention and our time. I've spoken quite a bit about this book in my favorites videos and stuff. I really, really liked this. It gave me a lot to think about and gave me some interesting, I don't know, parameters to put around things that I'd already been thinking of, if that makes sense. Really enjoyed it. The only section that felt less successful to me was the bit about social media. I just kind of didn't get her line of thinking. Her argument for me was not particularly strong around that, but the rest of the book I really liked. Now we're getting to the books that are a little bit more recent. I read The White Girl by Toni Birch, and this was a story I've been wanting to read for a little while. It kind of, I think, won a lot of awards last year here in Australia, and this is basically a fictionalized story of what is a very harsh reality here in Australia of the history of the stolen generation. And so in this story we have Odette, who is the grandmother of Sissy, and it's basically about their beautiful relationship living in a small town in an era where removal of children was a policy. And so this book is basically the story of what Odette does in attempt to keep Sissy safe and to keep them together. I did really like this story. I really like Toni Birch's writing. It's just so simple and colloquial, just really kind of gets the story across. But for me, my favorite part of this story was definitely the relationship that Sissy and Odette had. It was touching, it was beautiful. Then I read another manga. It was My Lesbian Experience with Romance by Kabi Nagata. This was just a short one-shot and it was a memoir. And it was basically the experience of the author, who is gay, but has never had sex, and I think she's in her late 20s. So she ends up hiring a sex worker to lose her virginity to. And in the manga, she's basically telling us about her life and what has led her up to this point of never having had sex, being a lesbian, hiring a sex worker. And a lot of it's quite sad. Our protagonist does deal with a lot of mental health struggles and also a lot of, I don't know, identity struggles. Then one of my favorite books I've read so far this year was There Was Still Love by Fievel Perret. This is an Australian novel, and it's basically told from the perspective of two children in the 1980s, I think it was. One is living here in Melbourne and the other is living in Czechoslovakia. And basically it is the story of them and their experiences in these different locations, but also of their grandmothers who were twins and separated during the war. So we do learn more about these sisters and their experiences, why they were separated and how that impacted them, you know, ending up in two very different places in the world. But we also learn about how living in those two different places has impacted them and their families, how they've each had to come to terms with identity and healing from grief and trauma in really different ways, and again how that has impacted the generations that follow. It's really quite a small story in a way, like it's just told from the perspective of these two children talking about their lives and their grandparents. But it is so emotionally impactful. It's one of those things that it felt quite small and simple, like nothing crazy. There's no plot twist or crazy thing that happens. It just is about these families. And at the end, I just was quietly crying for them. And it makes me a little bit emotional still. So I really loved that. I think that this book and the Murderbot series would probably be my favorite books that I've read so far this year. And I loved it so much that I immediately ordered the author's other two books. I have read one that was Past the Shallows, which was her debut back in 2013, I think. And this book was set in Tasmania. And it's a story of two boys and their father, who's very abusive. He's an alcoholic. And they are quite poor. And I don't know how much I can say without giving too much away, but the writing is beautiful in this book, both in terms of describing like the Tasmanian landscape, but also of the ocean, because the father is a fisherman and the older two brothers really love surfing. So it's a lot of description of ocean and water, and it plays quite a big role in the story of these boys and their father. The three brothers, one has kind of left home quite a while ago, so it's more focused on the two younger brothers and their relationship, and how the middle brother really feels a responsibility to take care of the youngest because he's quite sensitive, and since they've lost their mother, their father's kind of anger and outbursts and all of that is just really targeted towards the younger one, and the middle. Like, these boys just grow up in a really difficult family environment. So this was kind of more tragic and like overwhelmingly difficult and uncomfortable from an emotional experience, but I don't think it was as beautiful or moving in the same way that There Was Still Love was. I liked them both though, but There Was Still Love definitely was my favorite of the two so far. The next book I read was Queering the Tarot by Cassandra Snow, and I have done a full review on this book, which I know ruffled a few feathers, but I just felt was really important to get out there. This is my biggest disappointment of the year so far, and I did not enjoy making that review by any means, but I stand by everything that I said. So I'll leave a link to that in the description box below if you'd like to know more about my thoughts on that one. The next book I read was Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton, and this book has been such a big deal in Australian literature in the last 12 to 18 months. It won like all of the awards last year. And I sort of get why, but at the same time, like, this has, what was it, 4.42 average rating on GoodReads. I gave it 2. So I don't know whether I read a different book or what was going on. I don't really know how to describe this book without giving too much away. So I'll just say that it's about a family, in particular two brothers, Eli and August, who their family gets involved in some drug dealing, and the consequences of that are pretty intense. And so the book is basically, it's narrated by Eli, who's the younger of the two brothers. And I really enjoyed the first maybe 200 pages of this book. I really enjoyed Eli as the narrator. I loved the relationship between him and August. But then the book, for me, it just kind of unraveled. The second maybe 2/3 of the book were just a lot less successful for me. I don't know, as the book wore on, it just got a lot less interesting to me. Eli got annoying. You know that trope of not like other girls? It was like that, but not like other boys. Like, Eli is so quirky and unusual and special, and it annoyed me by the end of it. It felt self-indulgent to me. I think the author identified with Eli a lot. I think he's probably sort of like a fictionalized version of himself, and I wasn't into it. There was also quite a bit of like recurring symbolism in this book, and I was so interested to see where this went. Like, you know, if something's going to be recurring, it's obviously going to be really interesting, and I was expecting some unusual kind of out of the box twist reveal with it, but in the end it ended up being quite literal, which I don't know. I was just really disappointed by the end of it and not happy that I'd spent 15 hours reading it. Then we get into the last 4 books I've read, which I did a reading vlog on as well. I read It's Our Country, Indigenous Arguments for Meaningful Constitutional Recognition by Megan Davis and Marsha Langton. This is an anthology, a collection of essays and arguments from Aboriginal leaders, thinkers, and academics and lawyers talking about their views on constitutional recognition for the Aboriginal people and how it might be changed to better represent or acknowledge or hopefully make positive changes for the Aboriginal people. But it also discussed a lot of like other topics like treaty. Tradition, Truth and Tomorrow by Galarrwuy Yunupingu. This was a very, very short book, but a really impactful one. This is basically just Galarrwuy's own story of being a leader for his Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land, I think he's from, and just the years, the decades of advocacy and work that he's done, and some of the successes he's had, but also the disappointments he's experienced. And it's just very simply conveyed, but very, very impactful. It's beautiful. So that's probably also one of my favorite books that I've read this year. Escape Routes by Naomi Ishiguro. This was our latest Blossom Book Club book. This, another collection of short stories. I loved a handful of stories in this. In particular, Flat Roof, which dealt with grief in a very beautiful way, and Shearing Season, which was about a young boy who wanted to grow up to be an astronaut. And these stories all kind of dealt with anxiety and uncomfortable feelings like grief and stuff, very angsty, this book. And I really loved that some of these stories, although kind of very modern and straightforward, a lot of them incorporated just like little magical elements, especially at the end, which I really, really liked. They were quite beautiful. But there were a few stories in here that just really, I don't know, brought the whole thing down. In particular, The Ratcatcher, which ended up being 3 parts. So it was a big chunk of this book and was just, it was quite a gruesome story. And it didn't have any kind of significant emotional satisfaction or payoff at the end. So it just felt like a waste of time for me and definitely brought the caliber of the book as a whole down for me, which was disappointing because the few standout stories were incredible and I loved them. And then the most recent book that I finished was Rogue Protocol by Martha Wells, which is the 3rd book in the Motorbot Diaries. And I've already spoken about that series, but I really liked the 3rd one. So that is an overview of the 63 or so books that I have read so far in 2020. I'm feeling pretty good about my reading this year. I feel like I've read a pretty good range of books, both in terms of genres, but then also in formats with novels and manga, and I don't know, I'm really having a good time reading. As I said, I am making more of an effort to not only keep track of the books that I'm reading, but also to leave little reviews over on Goodreads, partly for my own benefit, but also I know some of you are interested. So if you do want to keep up with what I'm reading and what I'm liking and not liking, you can follow me over on Goodreads. I'll leave a link below. Of course, I have to thank my patrons over on Patreon for their ongoing support of me and this channel. Thanks to you, I get to keep making videos and making them for free for everybody else. I really do appreciate that support. And a big extra special thank you goes to Tracy Timmerman, Laurie, Lynette Brown, and the Hales K. And obviously quite a lot of these books I read with my patrons over on Patreon and our Discord server in our Blossom Book Club. So that's also been a great part of my reading journey this year. So thank you for that as well. I would love to hear some of your favorite books that you've read so far this year. Talk to me all things books in the comments. You know I'm always up for a chat about books. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will talk to you again very soon. So much love. Bye.